This video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Protect you and your online activity with just the click of a button. The other day, I was at a coffee shop with a friend. Each of us were there just getting our work done. My friend was accompanied by a client who was on a video call with him. This client was a game developer with a tech-related question. The client proceeded to share his computer screen, revealing a custom-designed and fairly odd but familiar looking desktop. Naturally, my friend's first question was, "Whoa, what is going on with your computer?" The client responded with what is easily one of the strangest and most interesting answers I've ever heard to a question. "Oh, I am running Windows XP." This freelancing game developer, professional mind you, gets his work done using an over 20-year-old operating system. I have no idea how or if he is using modern software to pull all this off, but from what I can tell, it looks like he is doing pretty okay. I had so much intrigue for the fact that this man was using an operating system that lost support back in 2014. I mean, there has to be some practical reason behind this, other than simply wanting to embrace a now vintage lifestyle, right? But what and why? In 2001, Microsoft came out with Windows XP. It was the OS which followed the releases of Windows Me and 2000. But the main direction XP intended to take was simplicity. And this makes a lot of sense. Microsoft struck gold with Windows 95 6 years prior, and we're now very much on the mindset of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Windows didn't need some game-changing layout overhauls. It needed to be more secure, fresher, and easier to use. Although it was primarily meant to be a more nuts and bolts update of Windows, it introduced a new UI and a ton of under-the-hood changes. Because of this, Windows XP had a warm, welcoming energy. Actually, a little too welcoming for some people. A lot of people initially criticized XP for its, at the time, unconventional, toy-like appearance, calling it a Fisher-Price OS. But regardless, this didn't stop people from upgrading their machines to it, and reviews were not only overwhelmingly positive, but Windows XP, in many respects, would prove to be, in the long term, one of Microsoft's most successful and beloved products in history. As it turns out, what the client at the coffee shop was doing wasn't actually all that unusual. In 2014, it was estimated that over 1 billion copies of Windows XP had been sold since its launch. Despite support having already ended in 2015, Windows XP was still the OS of choice for over 150 million users. The United States military even still runs Windows XP, and so do, statistically, about 1 out of every 100 computers. What exactly is going on? Microsoft has already come out with at least 4 more mainstream operating systems since then, yet millions of people, business, and even the strongest military in the world continue to use it. Not only that, Windows XP has seemed to develop a cult following of people who consider it to be the greatest operating system of all time. Even some bold enough to claim that it's still better than Windows 7 and 10. But why Windows XP in particular? Why does it seem to stand out so much among all other operating systems? Does this old, clunky, outdated software really have this charm to it that just ties people in and makes them too stubborn for change? Actually, yes. And today we are going to talk about what exactly made Windows XP not only so great for its time, but why it continues to be very active among PC circles even now. Windows XP may have been secure for its time, but it is nowhere near as secure as Surfshark VPN is today. Surfshark is an incredible tool designed to prioritize your safety and privacy when using the internet, while keeping it just as easy to use as ever before. By encrypting your data and changing your IP, a VPN prevents people from seeing your online activity or search history, protecting you from your ISP or potential hackers. However, Surfshark stands out from the other VPN providers, boasting its built-in Clean Web tool, designed to block any malware, trackers, or malicious ads from showing up on your computer when using the internet. With all these features, you will no longer have to worry about companies building profiles on you for advertisers or throttling your connection just based on your internet activity alone. But my personal favorite feature of Surfshark is being able to access geo-locked content. If you want to access content that is not available in your country, just simply change the location of your IP, and there you go. The best part? It only requires one subscription to install Surfshark on an unlimited number of devices across multiple platforms. With my link shown on the screen, you can get 83% off your subscription and 3 months completely free. So give Surfshark a try and help make the internet a safer place. Windows XP was able to establish such a positive name for itself for a multitude of reasons, which include its structuring, how it was compared to other OSs, and most importantly, its unplanned longevity. Windows XP's success starts during its development and how it was approached. This goes back to 1998. This is going to be a little bit of a refresher on Windows Me's development. If you haven't already watched my video on that, check it out. Originally, Microsoft intended to create 2 separate operating systems that focused on different target audiences, one for the home users and consumers, and one for businesses, respectfully given the codenames Windows Neptune and Odyssey. The late 90s were a time where computers were really starting to evolve. You've got the internet, laptops are becoming more commonplace and popular among younger people, and a lot of other things. MS-DOS, the foundation of Windows operating systems at the time, was starting to become outdated, and it was time for Microsoft to change things up a bit. They were instead focusing more on their line of software known as Windows NT, literally standing for New Technology. And Neptune was meant to be the first Windows version for consumers that would be built on it, getting rid of MS-DOS completely. It introduced features that would be seen in XP, such as Firewall and a similar logon screen. Not a whole lot of information is available on Odyssey, other than that it was worked on alongside Neptune. Ultimately, both these projects would be merged into a new project codenamed Whistler, as Microsoft chose to release Windows Me to consumers instead, which would be a rookie mistake. Beta releases of the Whistler OS would be released up until the end of 2001, where it was released under its official name of Windows XP, an abbreviation for Experience. Evidently, XP introduced a ton of new features, many of which seemed standard and ordinary at the time, but would prove to be incredibly impactful in the long term. To name a few, this would include device driver rollback. This is something that we even see today with Windows 10. If you have a device driver update that for some reason just does not want to cooperate and is causing terrible crashes and instability, with just the push of a button, you can revert to the previous version. Just one small feature like this has saved users arguably hundreds of hours of arduous work. Another one is Remote Desktop. Although this was incredibly ahead of its time compared to the capabilities of previous Windows versions, it was standard in the sense that many technologies were going to adapt it at that same time anyway. Heck, Apple released its Remote Desktop program on OS X not even 6 months later. But regardless, Windows XP being the first to adapt it only worked in its favor. And even now, Remote Desktop has saved many people from trips to the store, and has allowed them to solve their problems and transfer their files in the comfort of their own homes. Lastly, arguably the most impactful feature that Windows XP had for creating its success was merging the codebases of the Windows 9X and NT product lines into one. Remember how we mentioned that MS-DOS was starting to become both outdated as well as a security risk? Well, this was a big issue for most of the current Windows versions. All of Microsoft's home-based operating systems were built on the Windows 9X kernel, which included an underlying foundation of MS-DOS. This was quickly going to become a problem as software got more sophisticated, so there was huge demand for Microsoft to jump ship and head over to the much more stable NT-based model. But there was a caveat to this. Although this new NT-based Windows would be much more stable and secure, most, if not all, the Windows 9X-based programs would just not run on it properly. Despite that it was quickly aging, Windows 9X was still being used by tons of people, and the apps and drivers that they rely on might not work on NT-based platforms. Consequently, they were stuck on an unstable and insecure system. It was a double-edged sword. There was a workaround for this though, to merge both 9X and NT together. This was a very ambitious feature for Microsoft to introduce, and a lot of users wanted to see it. And finally, Windows XP actually did it. For the first time, there was a Windows OS that combined the 9X and NT codebases, and now users could benefit from the best of both worlds. Windows XP allowed them access to the stability of NT, while also being able to, say, run Sid Meier's Civilization 3 without worrying about the system crashing. People could work with their favorite software without having to leave their comfort zone. It was the ideal compromise between business and home. Of course, there were some cases where DOS and 9X-based programs could not run natively on an NT environment like XP. But XP's approach helped this be way less of a problem than it could have been. Emulators such as DOSBox or virtual machines could circumvent this issue, and another new, at the time standard feature called Compatibility Mode helped with these problems too. This feature allowed you to essentially trick the program into thinking that you were running it on, say, Windows 98 or 95. The feature was introduced in Windows 2000 Service Pack 2. But this was a business operating system, so the feature's continued presence in XP revealed it to a ton of new home users. So for most of them, the first time they saw this feature was in XP. Again, another feature that would prove to be revolutionary over time. It wasn't perfect, but it helped things tremendously. To sum it all up, people liked XP at the time because these features, which ended up being executed very well, gave it, for the most part, a great first impression. On top of this, how Windows XP was distributed helped a lot as well. Because NT was new, it was also a bit expensive. Windows 2000's retail price was about $320, much more than the standard price of 9X Windows at the time. Rather than putting XP at this price range, a full purchase of Windows XP was about $20 cheaper, and those upgrading to Windows XP from 98 or 95 would save more money than those who upgraded to 2000 upon its initial release. Windows XP was offering a cheaper starting price while also providing more. As a result, all of these decisions attracted a lot of people to Windows XP, and gave these users and businesses the opportunity to make a pretty big upgrade at quite an affordable price. Over the next couple of years, people using XP were quite pleased with their upgrade, and at this point, it did just about everything that they wanted it to. The release of Service Pack 2 had just about the least number of bugs of any other Windows release, and arguably made it one of the most stable operating systems at the time. During all of this, Microsoft was now developing and hyping up what would soon become Windows Vista, and ironically, this would actually solidify XP's positive reputation even further. Windows XP would find itself being compared to other operating systems, so in some ways, it wasn't that Windows XP was that good, but that the other operating systems were that bad, at least at the time. Right before XP, you had Windows Me, which had a terrible reputation upon release. For those that did the upgrade from Me to XP, it felt like a total breath of fresh air to get such a step up in stability. Then after XP, you have the failure of Windows Vista. A lot of consumers were unhappy with its problems and decided to just stick with XP because it wasn't doing any of the damage that might show up with upgrading. Luckily, by the time Windows 7 arrived in 2009, many people actually were convinced to switch, and Windows XP's market share would decline rather quickly. But this didn't convince everyone. Some people saw Windows 7 as just a remarketed version of Vista, and were skeptical. Consequently, they still stuck to XP because even 8 years later, it was still doing what they needed it to do. In some cases, Windows XP was being compared to other operating systems rather unfairly, and this was apparent with the release of Windows 8 in 2012. For a lot of reasons, Windows 8 was a disaster. So of course, people didn't want to upgrade, and as you'd expect, the now much smaller group of XP users just stuck to their guns. It might seem unreasonable to compare Windows XP and Windows 8, and that's because it is. These OSs came out over a decade apart, and both systems supported different computer needs and whatnot. But users didn't care, because even a whole year after XP lost support, it still had more users than Windows 8. Some other operating systems, like Mac OS X, were actually catching up in the game rather quickly, especially with the release of OS X Snow Leopard in 2009. Though this didn't have as much of an impact on XP as other Windows versions might have. That's because not all, but a lot of Windows users were just too comfortable in the Microsoft environment and weren't planning on buying a new Apple computer, so they didn't pay any regard to whatever Mac was doing. It was comparing apples and oranges. Ultimately, Microsoft's series of misfortunes would actually benefit XP and contribute to its most important factor: longevity. This was the biggest component in making Windows XP so successful. Because the majority of their newly released Windows versions were not very well received, Microsoft was basically stuck continuing XP support. People were now using a 10-year-old operating system, and they were okay with it. Windows XP had become an old friend, and receiving a decade's worth of updates made it incredibly reliable. The OS was given such a long period to resonate with people, as well as the opportunity to introduce itself to another generation. For a huge range of ages, Windows XP was something that was just nostalgic for each person in its own way. And including the other reasons we just covered, a lot of them just didn't want to change. At this point in time, XP was sort of aging like a fine wine, and for two main reasons: its use of hardware and software. Because Windows XP was now so old but still relatively mainstream, it had something a lot of OSs didn't: high capability, low demand. By, say, 2012 standards, Windows XP's hardware requirements were now very low, and anybody with just average hardware, as long as it still supported it, could run it with incredible performance. This was a great option for people who didn't really have a whole lot of money to get powerful hardware, but still wanted to get things done without problem. In addition, because XP was still supported by Microsoft, this meant that a lot of third-party software still supported it as well. Let me remind you, an operating system from 2001 was still getting support from programs made in the 2010s. In other words, a lot of people using XP in 2011-2012 were having a pretty good time. They could run about 10 to 12 years worth of software, including some 9X-based programs, with virtually no compatibility issues and without needing expensive hardware. And for those reasons, Windows XP was still the way to go. So we've talked about what made Windows XP so great at the time, but what about now? I mean, now we have Windows 11, and support for XP ended in 2014. It's outdated in every way, shape, or form, and now completely vulnerable to security problems. Yet it continues to be used and remains to be the favorite of many people. Why? With everything we've just gone over, the answer is quite simple. It's the same reason as it was back in the early 2010s: cost and compatibility. Just on a smaller scale. A lot of users might not have the money to upgrade their systems at all. You actually see this in a lot of developing countries, as well as low-funded businesses and schools. Windows XP doesn't require a lot of computing resources nowadays and fulfills basic user needs. Also, even now with, say, Windows 10, a lot of users still need to rely on old software that can only run on XP. Well, they could just run the program through Compatibility Mode. Problem solved. But as we mentioned earlier, This didn't always work. Compatibility mode did improve things significantly, but it wasn't perfect. So there are some cases where the actual OS needs to be running. Well, they could use a new Windows version and just run XP through a virtual machine. But that can be costly, and even free alternatives like VirtualBox would still require, for businesses for example, the cost of user training. On top of that, virtual machines don't fix hardware incompatibilities. These users might also have hardware like printers and scanners that also only work on XP, and that equipment would first have to work on the new version of Windows before working on the virtual machine. It all becomes convoluted, and these users are actually willing to risk the lack of security because of this. While Windows XP may not be supported by Microsoft anymore, one of the only exceptions is the military, and it's for this exact reason. An overwhelming amount of critical government software actually cannot run on new operating systems. With the reasons we've mentioned, upgrading these computers is way too risky, unless you want to put a giant crater in the earth. The easier route is to just pay Microsoft huge amounts of money to continue security updates. And lastly, another reason people still use Windows XP that might seem a bit superficial is simply because they like it. They just like how it looks. It's simple, it's nostalgic. For a lot of people, including myself, growing up in the early 2000s was a pretty magical time. And what was a huge component of early 2000s culture because of longevity? Well, Windows XP. It's their favorite operating system because it reminds them of a nicer, simpler time. Depending on your age, an era of fun and no responsibility. And it's the simple things that bring them back to that. Whether that's the iconic startup sound or that beautiful field of green. Oh, and SearchDog was terrible. Is Windows XP your favorite operating system? If so, why? Let me know that in the comments below. Don't forget that you can use my code located in the description to get 83% off and 3 months free on your Surfshark VPN subscription. You can't miss a deal like that. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you never miss a future video. Also check out my Patreon to get access to exclusive content and to watch videos early.